Silence has a reputation for being neutral, a simple absence of words rather than a statement of its own. This reputation is not true. Every unspoken thing you carry continues to speak, whether or not you ever open your mouth to say it, through the tightness in your chest around certain people, through the distance you keep without explaining why, through the way your body flinches at a subject you swore you'd made peace with. What you don't say does not disappear. It relocates, quietly, into the places words were never given permission to go. Consider the specific mechanics of what happens when something significant goes unsaid. In the moment, silence often feels like control, a way of managing a difficult truth without the mess of actually voicing it, without risking the reaction it might provoke. But that control is temporary, and it comes at a cost most people don't calculate honestly at the time. The unsaid thing doesn't vanish once the moment passes. It sits, waiting, gathering weight, until it finds another way to surface. In a moment of unexplained anger towards someone unrelated, in a physical symptom with no clear medical cause, in a wall that quietly appears in a relationship that used to feel close. This is why people who have carried something unspoken for years often describe a specific, disorienting exhaustion, not from any single event, but from the accumulated effort of managing a truth that was never allowed to simply exist out loud. Holding something back requires ongoing labor, vigilance around certain topics, careful navigation around certain people, a constant low-grade management of what might slip out if the guard were ever lowered. This labor is invisible to everyone except the person doing it, and it drains resources that could otherwise be spent living rather than managing. It is worth naming honestly why silence so often feels like the safer choice in the first place, because the reasons are usually good ones, even if the long-term cost is high. Silence protects relationships that feel too fragile to survive the truth. It protects a sense of peace, however thin, in situations where conflict feels genuinely dangerous. It protects an image of the strong one, the easygoing one, the one who never causes trouble, that took years to build and feels impossible to risk. None of these reasons are foolish. They are simply reasons that, over time, quietly compound into the exact weight this book is asking you to finally examine. Consider, too, how what goes unsaid between two people rarely stays contained to just the two of them. A parent's unspoken resentment toward a partner often reaches the children in the house, absorbed as tension they can feel but never fully understand. An employee's unspoken frustration with a manager reaches their work in the form of quiet disengagement no formal review will ever capture accurately. The unsaid thing radiates outward, shaping the emotional weather of everyone nearby, even when those people have no idea what specifically is being withheld. There is also a particular danger in mistaking silence for resolution. Many people believe, genuinely, that enough time has passed that a difficult truth no longer needs to be spoken, that it has simply dissolved on its own, the way old news eventually stops mattering. This is rarely accurate. Time does not resolve an unspoken truth. It simply buries it deeper, and the digging required to reach it again, years later, is almost always harder than the honesty that was avoided in the first place would have been. Understand, finally, that this book is not asking you to say everything to everyone, indiscriminately, regardless of consequence. Discretion and honesty are not opposites, and there is real wisdom in choosing carefully what gets said, to whom, and when. What this book is asking is that you become honest with yourself first about what you are carrying and why, before deciding, deliberately rather than by default, what deserves to finally be spoken and what can be released without ever needing to be said aloud to anyone but yourself. The weight of unspoken things is not a life sentence. It is simply what accumulates when honesty gets deferred long enough. The rest of this book is about understanding that weight clearly, and about what it takes, chapter by chapter, to finally set it down. Consider, too, the specific way unspoken things distort a person's sense of their own history over time. Memory is not a fixed recording, filed away unchanged. It is a living thing, revisited and reshaped every time it is recalled. And an unspoken truth left unexamined for years tends to grow, in the retelling that happens only inside a person's own mind, into something larger and more distorted than the original event actually was. Without the correcting influence of ever speaking it aloud to another person, who might respond, question, or offer a different perspective, the unspoken thing is left to grow unchecked in isolation, often becoming heavier and more frightening in private memory than it would have remained had it simply been spoken and examined honestly at the time. There is a particular physical toll worth naming directly, because the weight described throughout this chapter is not merely metaphorical. Chronic suppression of significant emotional truth has been linked, across a substantial body of research, to measurable physical costs. Elevated stress hormones sustained over long periods, disrupted sleep, and a general erosion of the body's capacity to regulate itself under ordinary daily stress. The body, in a very real sense, keeps track of what the mouth has been trained not to say, and it does not do so without cost. Consider, too, how the specific relief people describe after finally speaking something long withheld is rarely proportional to the size of the original secret. Often, the thing finally spoken turns out to be smaller, less catastrophic, or less unforgivable than years of private rehearsal had made it seem. This is not universally true. Some truths are genuinely as serious as they felt while unspoken. But it is common enough to be worth naming directly. Silence itself, over enough time, tends to inflate a truth's imagined danger well beyond what speaking it honestly usually reveals. Finally, understand that this book does not ask you to treat every silence as equally urgent or equally worth breaking. Some things genuinely are better left unsaid, weighed carefully against real consequences that deserve serious consideration rather than impulsive disclosure. What this chapter asks specifically is that you stop mistaking silence for a cost-free default, recognizing clearly from this point forward that every unspoken thing you carry is doing quiet work in your body and your relationships, whether or not you ever choose to name it out loud. Chapter 2. The Silence That Raised You. Before you learned to withhold anything as an adult, you were taught, usually without a single explicit lesson, what could and could not be said in the environment that raised you. Every family, every household, operates on an unspoken curriculum of what topics are safe and what topics are dangerous, and children absorb this curriculum with startling speed, long before they have the language to describe what they've learned. Consider how this curriculum gets taught, because it is rarely delivered through direct instruction. A child who mentions a forbidden topic and watches a parent's face tighten, or the subject change abruptly, or the room grow suddenly quiet, learns the lesson just as thoroughly as if they had been told directly. This is not something we discuss here. This lesson requires no repetition to take hold. Children are remarkably attuned to these subtle shifts, and one or two clear signals are often enough to establish, for years or even decades afterward, exactly which truths are permitted and which must be carried silently. This early training explains why so many adults find themselves unable to voice things that, logically, as adults with full autonomy, they should be free to say. The inability is rarely about present-day fear of the actual consequences. It is about an old, deeply grooved pattern, established long before the adult version of the person existed, that still treats certain subjects as fundamentally unsafe, regardless of how much the actual circumstances have since changed. The nervous system, in these moments, is not responding to the present. It is responding to a much older rule that was never formally updated. Consider, too, how different households teach different specific curricula, and how recognizing your own household's particular lessons is often the first step toward understanding your own specific silences. Some households taught that anger of any kind was dangerous, producing adults who suppress even legitimate anger decades later. Some households taught that need or vulnerability invited ridicule, producing adults who cannot ask for help even when genuinely struggling. Some households taught that certain family members were simply not to be questioned or challenged, producing adults who still, well into their own adulthood, feel a specific paralysis around confronting that same family member about anything at all. It is worth being honest that this early training was rarely delivered with cruel intent. Most parents who raised children into silence were themselves raised the same way, passing forward a curriculum they never consciously chose to create, simply because it was the only curriculum they had ever known. Understanding this does not erase the real cost the silence produced. It does, however, allow for a more accurate, less blame-saturated understanding of where your own particular silences originally came from, not as a personal failing, but as an inheritance, passed down largely unconsciously, generation after generation. Consider, too, how this early training continues operating in adult relationships long after the original household is no longer physically present to enforce it. A person raised to believe conflict was dangerous will often experience genuine physiological alarm at the mere anticipation of a difficult conversation with a partner or colleague, regardless of how emotionally safe that specific adult relationship actually is. The old rule fires automatically, faster than conscious thought, because it was installed at an age when survival genuinely did depend on correctly reading which subjects were safe to raise. Breaking free of this inherited curriculum begins with the specific, deliberate work of naming it accurately, identifying as precisely as you can exactly what your own household taught you was unsafe to say, and to whom. This naming does not immediately dissolve the old pattern, but it does something important. It moves the rule from an invisible, automatic reflex into something you can finally see clearly enough to begin questioning, rather than simply obeying without ever examining where it came from in the first place. Understand, finally, that recognizing the silence that raised you is not about assigning blame to the people who raised you, nor is it about excusing every subsequent silence as simply their fault rather than yours to address now. It is about accurate diagnosis, understanding the origin clearly enough that you can distinguish, honestly, between an old inherited rule that no longer serves you and a genuinely wise, present-day discretion that still does. That distinction is where the real work of this book begins.
Consider, too, the specific role that fear of a particular family member's reaction plays in enforcing this early curriculum, long after that family member has lost any real power over the adult's life. A grown adult, financially independent and living states or countries away from their family of origin, can still feel a genuine, disproportionate dread at the thought of raising a forbidden subject with a parent, because the nervous system's old alarm does not automatically update simply because circumstances have changed. This is worth naming clearly, because many people mistake this old alarm for present-day evidence that the subject truly remains as dangerous as it once was, rather than recognizing it as an outdated reflex still firing from a much earlier chapter of their life. There is also a specific pattern worth watching for in adulthood: the tendency to recreate the same silence-enforcing dynamics with new people, entirely unrelated to the original family, simply because those dynamics feel familiar in a way that genuine openness does not. A person raised in a household that punished emotional expression may find themselves, without consciously choosing to, drawn toward partners, friends, or workplaces that replicate the same unspoken rule, mistaking the familiar discomfort of suppression for the normal texture of any close relationship, simply because it is the only texture they've ever known intimately. Consider, too, how siblings raised in the exact same household frequently absorb the unspoken curriculum differently, depending on their birth order, temperament, or the specific role they were assigned within the family system. An older sibling, tasked implicitly with keeping the peace, may internalize a different, though related, set of silences than a younger sibling who learned early to stay invisible in order to avoid becoming a target. Understanding that even people who grew up in the identical household may carry meaningfully different silences helps explain why family members, revisiting the same shared history as adults, often disagree sharply about what actually happened and about how significant any of it truly was. Finally, understand that unlearning this inherited curriculum is rarely a single decisive act. It tends to happen gradually, through repeated small experiments, testing in low-stakes situations first whether a subject once treated as forbidden can actually be raised without producing the catastrophic consequence the old training predicted. Each successful experiment weakens the old rule's grip slightly, building, over time, genuine evidence that contradicts what the original household taught, until the old curriculum finally loses enough of its power to be replaced by something closer to genuine, present-day choice about what deserves to be said and what does not.
Chapter 3. Carrying What Was Never Yours. Some of the heaviest silence a person carries was never actually theirs to carry in the first place. It belongs to someone else's shame, someone else's secret, someone else's unresolved history, handed to a child, often unintentionally, simply because that child happened to be present, or trusted, or too young to understand that the burden being placed on them was never appropriate to place on a child at all. Consider how this transfer typically happens, because it is rarely a single dramatic event. A parent's private struggle, witnessed by a child too young to process it, becomes something the child quietly learns to protect, not because anyone explicitly asked them to keep it secret, but because the child absorbed, correctly or not, that exposing it would cause harm. A family's private shame around money, addiction, or a painful history becomes something every member silently agrees never to name outside the house, and the youngest members inherit this agreement without ever having consented to it, simply by growing up inside a home where the agreement was already firmly in place. This kind of inherited weight is particularly heavy precisely because it was never chosen. A person can, with effort, eventually make peace with the consequences of their own choices, even difficult ones. Making peace with the consequences of someone else's choices, silently carried because you happened to witness them at a vulnerable age, is a fundamentally different and often more disorienting task, because there is no clear sense of agency to work with, only a weight that arrived without your consent and has been quietly shaping your life ever since. Consider, too, how carrying someone else's unspoken burden often produces a specific kind of chronic vigilance, distinct from ordinary anxiety.
A person carrying inherited family shame frequently develops an acute sensitivity to how their family is perceived by outsiders, monitoring conversations, deflecting questions, managing information long before they consciously understand why this monitoring feels so urgently necessary. This vigilance is exhausting precisely because its original purpose, protecting a family secret they never chose to protect, has usually long outlived any genuine present-day necessity, if it was ever genuinely necessary at all. It is worth naming, honestly, the specific grief involved in recognizing that some of your heaviest silence was never actually yours. There is a particular kind of anger, sometimes delayed by years, that surfaces once a person realizes the weight they've been carrying, often at real cost to their own well-being, was placed on them by someone else's failure to protect them from information or responsibility they were too young or too powerless to have ever been given in the first place. This anger, when it finally surfaces, deserves space rather than immediate suppression, because it is often the first honest acknowledgement that the burden was never rightfully the carrier's to bear. Consider, too, the specific work of beginning to hand back what was never yours, even symbolically, even if the original person who placed the burden on you is no longer available, willing, or safe to have that conversation with directly. This handing back does not require a confrontation in every case. Sometimes it looks like a private, deliberate acknowledgement, naming clearly, even only to yourself or a therapist, that this particular weight belongs to someone else's history, not your own, and that you are choosing, from this point forward, to stop carrying it as though it were. Understand, finally, that distinguishing between what genuinely belongs to you and what was simply handed to you by someone else's unresolved history is one of the most liberating distinctions available in this entire book. Not every unspoken thing you carry needs to be spoken by you specifically. Some of it needs only to be recognized clearly enough to be set down, returned, at least in your own understanding, to the person or circumstance it actually originated from, freeing you to carry forward only the weight that was ever genuinely yours to hold. Consider, too, a particular and often overlooked category of inherited weight: the unspoken expectations a family silently transfers onto a child regarding what that child is meant to accomplish, repair, or redeem on behalf of the family's own unmet hopes. A child who senses, without ever being told directly, that they are meant to succeed where a parent failed, or to hold a family's reputation together through their own achievements, carries a burden that was never explicitly named, and therefore can never be explicitly refused. This kind of inherited expectation is particularly difficult to identify precisely because no one ever states it plainly enough to argue with. It simply exists, silently, shaping decisions about career, relationships, and even identity for years before the person carrying it fully recognizes its source. It is worth examining, too, how cultural and generational context shapes what specific burdens tend to get silently transferred within families. In households shaped by significant hardship, migration, or survival under difficult historical circumstances, children often absorb an unspoken duty to justify, through their own success or stability, the sacrifices previous generations made. This duty, while sometimes acknowledged with genuine gratitude, can also become an inherited weight indistinguishable from the inside, from the person's own authentic ambitions, making it especially difficult to recognize where the parent's unspoken hope ends and the child's own genuine desire begins. Consider, too, the specific relief available once a person successfully separates their own genuine desires from the inherited weight of someone else's unspoken hopes or unresolved shame. This separation does not require rejecting the people who placed the burden there, nor does it require abandoning genuine values that happen to overlap with what was inherited. It requires a careful, honest sorting process, examining each significant burden individually and asking plainly, is this something I would choose to carry even if no one had ever silently handed it to me? Or is this weight I have simply never questioned because it arrived so early and so quietly that it started to feel like part of who I naturally am? Finally, recognize that setting down what was never yours to carry is not a single event, but an ongoing practice, revisited whenever old patterns resurface under stress. The habits built from carrying someone else's unspoken burden for years do not disappear the moment they are correctly identified. They require patient, repeated practice to genuinely unlearn. What changes once the recognition described in this chapter has genuinely taken hold is that the weight stops feeling inevitable. It becomes instead something you can finally see clearly enough to choose deliberately whether to keep carrying at all. Chapter 4. The cost of the image you protect. Somewhere along the way, most people stop protecting the truth and start protecting an image of themselves instead. And the two get confused so gradually that few people notice the switch actually happened. The image is usually a good one, the reliable one, the strong one, the one who has it together. And it was built, often over decades, out of real effort. But an image, however accurate it once was, is not the same thing as a whole person. And the gap between the two is where a great deal of unspoken weight quietly. Chapter 5. When silence becomes a relationship. There is a particular point in many long relationships, romantic, familial, or close friendships, where the silence between two people stops being an occasional feature of the relationship and becomes, quietly, the relationship's actual foundation. Two people can share a home, a history, and genuine affection for one another, while both privately withholding something significant enough that the connection they maintain is, in an important sense, a connection between two curated versions of themselves, rather than the two people underneath. Consider how gradually this shift tends to happen. It rarely begins with a decision to withhold something forever. It begins with a single, difficult conversation, postponed, for understandable reasons, to a better time. That better time does not arrive on its own, and the postponement, repeated often enough, hardens into a habit, and the habit eventually becomes an unspoken agreement neither person ever explicitly proposed. Certain things, between us, simply do not get said. Once that agreement is in place, both people begin unconsciously organizing their behavior around protecting it. This is worth naming specifically because from the outside such relationships can look entirely functional, even enviable. Two people can be affectionate, cooperative, and genuinely committed to one another, while both quietly managing an entire category of experience that never gets discussed between them. A resentment, a regret, a fear, a desire. Each one certain that raising it would cause more damage than continuing to carry it privately. The relationship in this condition is real, but it is also incomplete in a way only the two people inside it can fully sense. Consider, too, the specific fatigue that accumulates in a relationship organized this way, distinct from ordinary relational friction. It is exhausting to be close to someone while simultaneously managing what cannot be said to them, because genuine closeness and active management do not coexist easily. Many people in this situation describe a strange, persistent loneliness, even inside relationships they would describe, if asked directly, as good ones. A loneliness that makes sense only once the specific, unspoken agreement organizing the relationship is named clearly. It is worth being honest, too, that not every relationship can or should bear the weight of everything unsaid within it. Some things withheld are genuinely being withheld with care, in recognition that voicing them would cause harm disproportionate to any relief gained. This book does not ask you to dismantle every silence inside every relationship indiscriminately. It asks that you become honest, first with yourself, about which silences are protecting the relationship and which silences have quietly become the relationship's replacement for actual intimacy. Consider, too, how the specific fear of ending a relationship as it currently exists often keeps this dynamic firmly in place. Chapter 6. The difference between peace and avoidance. Peace and avoidance can look almost identical from the outside, and often from the inside as well, which is precisely what makes the distinction between them so easy to miss for years at a time. Both produce a household or a relationship free of visible conflict. Both allow difficult subjects to go unraised. The difference between them is not in what is said or unsaid in any given moment. It is in what is happening underneath the silence, and only an honest look inward can usually tell the two apart. Consider the specific test worth applying to any silence you are maintaining. Does this quiet feel settled, or does it feel held? Genuine peace around a difficult subject tends to feel calm even when the subject is directly raised. There is no bracing, no dread, no sense that the topic must be carefully steered around. Avoidance, by contrast, requires ongoing effort to maintain. It is a quiet that has to be defended actively against the possibility that the subject might surface, and that defensive effort is usually the clearest signal available that what looks like peace is, underneath, something closer to management. It is worth naming honestly why avoidance so often gets mistaken for peace, because the mistake is understandable rather than foolish. Avoidance genuinely does produce many of the same short-term benefits as real peace does: reduced conflict, a calmer household, fewer difficult conversations to navigate. The mistake is assuming these short-term benefits mean the underlying issue has actually been resolved, rather than simply postponed at the cost of ongoing vigilance that most people, understandably, would rather not examine too closely. Consider, too, how avoidance tends to require an expanding set of restrictions over time, in a way that genuine peace does not. A relationship organized around avoiding one difficult subject often finds that subject's territory quietly growing, as related topics become similarly unsafe to raise, until entire categories of honest conversation have been excluded simply because they might eventually lead back to the original unaddressed issue. Genuine peace does not behave this way. It does not require an ever-widening perimeter of avoided subjects to maintain itself. There is a specific bodily signal worth learning to recognize here, because the body is often more honest about this distinction than conscious thought is. A genuinely peaceful silence tends to feel light in the body, settled, unremarkable, requiring no particular effort to sustain. An avoidant silence tends to carry a specific, low-grade tension, even in otherwise pleasant moments, a background readiness to change the subject or manage the conversation if it drifts too close to the thing being protected. Learning to notice this tension honestly is often more reliable than any amount of conscious self-assessment. Consider, too, that distinguishing peace from avoidance is not a one-time diagnosis, but something that needs to be revisited as circumstances change. A silence that was genuine peace at one point in a relationship can quietly become avoidance later, once new information, new stakes, or new patterns make what was once genuinely settled, newly unsettled again.
The distinction is not static, and treating it as though it were settled permanently once assessed is itself a subtle form of the same avoidance this chapter is examining. Understand, finally, that this distinction matters because avoidance, unlike genuine peace, tends to compound. What is avoided today does not stay the same size tomorrow. It accumulates interest in the form of accumulated distance, accumulated vigilance, and an accumulated gap between the relationship as it appears and the relationship as it actually is. Learning to ask honestly of any silence you maintain, whether it is settled or simply held, is one of the more practical tools this book has to offer, and it is worth applying often, rather than concluding once and assuming it will remain true forever.
Chapter 7. What fear is actually protecting. Fear of speaking a difficult truth is rarely a single, simple emotion, however much it may feel that way in the moment. Underneath the general sense of dread sits a specific, usually unexamined prediction about what will happen if the words are actually said. A prediction that, once identified clearly, is often far more specific and far more testable than the vague dread surrounding it initially suggests. Consider the value of naming this prediction explicitly, rather than simply feeling its weight. Fear of speaking rarely says honestly, only, "I am afraid." It says something much more specific. If I say this, she will leave. If I say this, he will never look at me the same way again. If I say this, everyone will finally see that I am not who they thought I was. These specific predictions can be examined, questioned, and sometimes tested in small ways in a manner that a vague, unexamined sense of dread cannot be. It is worth being honest that some of these specific predictions are accurate, and this book does not pretend otherwise. Some truths, spoken honestly, genuinely do end relationships, genuinely do change how a person is perceived, genuinely do carry real and lasting consequences. Naming the specific fear clearly is not a guarantee that the fear is wrong. It is simply a way of trading a vague, unmanageable dread for a specific, weighable risk, one that can be considered honestly against the specific cost of continuing to carry the unspoken thing instead. Consider, too, how frequently the specific prediction underneath a fear turns out, once genuinely examined, to be older than the relationship it is currently attached to. A fear of a partner's anger may trace back to a much earlier fear of a parent's anger, transferred largely intact onto a person who has, in fact, never behaved anything like the original source of that fear. Recognizing this transfer does not automatically dissolve the fear, but it does allow a more accurate weighing of the actual risk in front of you now, rather than the risk your nervous system learned to expect decades earlier. There is also a specific kind of fear worth naming separately. The fear not of the other person's reaction, but of your own reaction to finally saying the thing out loud. The fear that speaking it will make it more real, more undeniable than it has felt while it remained safely unspoken. This fear is protecting something different from relational safety. It is protecting a kind of internal distance from a truth the person is not yet ready to fully feel, and it deserves to be treated with a corresponding gentleness, rather than pushed past before that internal readiness has actually arrived. Consider, too, that fear serves a genuine protective function, and this chapter is not arguing that fear should simply be overridden in every case. Fear that has been examined honestly and found to be tracking a real and current risk deserves to be respected as legitimate information about the actual stakes involved. What this chapter asks is that fear be examined rather than simply obeyed by default. distinguishing, case by case, between fear that is accurately protecting you from a real, present danger and fear that is simply an old alarm, firing out of habit, long after the original danger it was calibrated to has passed. Understand, finally, that naming exactly what a fear is protecting, specifically, concretely, rather than in the vague terms fear usually presents itself in, is one of the most useful practical steps available anywhere in this book. It will not remove the fear entirely, and it should not be expected to. But it converts an unmanageable dread into a specific question that can actually be examined, weighed, and in many cases, found to be carrying less genuine danger than years of unexamined avoidance had allowed it to accumulate.
Chapter 8. The conversation you've been rehearsing for years. Many people carry somewhere in the back of their mind a conversation they have rehearsed hundreds of times and had exactly 0 times. A version of a difficult truth, refined and re-refined in private over years, that has never once been spoken aloud to the person it is actually meant for. This rehearsed conversation deserves closer attention than most people give it, because the version living in someone's head is rarely the version that would actually need to be said out loud. Consider what tends to happen to a conversation rehearsed privately for years without ever being tested against reality. It grows sharper in some places and more elaborate in others, absorbing every grievance and justification that has occurred to the person since the original moment, until the rehearsed version bears only partial resemblance to what the original, simpler truth actually was. This is worth naming honestly, because a person who finally attempts to deliver this heavily rehearsed version often finds it lands very differently than intended, carrying years of accumulated weight the other person has no context for and no fair way of receiving. It is worth distinguishing, then, between the rehearsed version of a difficult truth and its simplest, most honest form. The rehearsed version is usually built for defense, anticipating every objection, every possible rebuttal, every way the other person might try to minimize or deflect what is being said. The simplest form is usually much shorter, much less defended, and considerably harder to say precisely because it offers no armor. It is simply the thing that is true, stated plainly, without the years of accumulated justification wrapped around it. Consider, too, how the act of rehearsing itself can quietly become a substitute for the actual conversation, rather than preparation for it. Rehearsing provides a genuine, if partial, sense of relief. The truth gets voiced, at least internally, and some of its pressure is released, which can create the mistaken impression that something has actually been resolved. It has not. The private rehearsal changes nothing in the actual relationship. It only changes the internal experience of the person doing the rehearsing. And mistaking that internal shift for genuine progress can keep a person circling the same unspoken conversation for years without ever actually approaching it. There is real value in examining, honestly, what specifically the rehearsed version has accumulated over the years of private repetition that the original, simpler truth did not originally contain. Often, a significant portion of what has been added is not the core truth itself, but resentment about not yet having said it, frustration of the other person for not somehow already knowing, irritation at oneself for the years of delay. Separating this accumulated resentment from the original truth is often the necessary work before any actual conversation can happen, because delivering the resentment instead of the truth rarely produces the outcome the person actually wants. Consider, too, that finding the simplest, least defended version of a long-rehearsed truth is often best done on paper or in conversation with someone outside the situation entirely,
before ever attempting to say it to the person it concerns. This is not evasion. It is preparation of a genuinely useful kind, allowing the years of accumulated elaboration to be stripped away in a lower stakes setting first, so that what eventually gets said to the person who actually needs to hear it is closer to the honest core of the matter than to the heavily fortified version built up in years of private rehearsal. Understand, finally, that the goal of finally having this conversation is rarely to deliver every point accumulated over years of rehearsal. It is to say the simplest, true version of the thing, clearly enough to finally be heard, and to trust that the years of additional argument you have privately built around it were mostly there to protect you from having to say it at all. Protection that, once the conversation actually happens, is very often no longer necessary.
Chapter 9. Speaking without detonating. There is a particular fear, distinct from fear of the truth itself, that keeps many difficult conversations permanently unspoken. The fear that once the words finally leave your mouth, they will arrive with more force than intended, doing more damage in the delivery than the truth itself would ever have required. This fear is not unreasonable. Truths held silently for years genuinely can detonate when they finally surface, and learning to speak them without that detonation is a skill worth developing deliberately rather than assuming the words will simply find their own safe shape in the moment. Consider the specific mechanism by which a long-held truth tends to detonate rather than land gently. Years of suppression build genuine pressure, and pressure, released suddenly, tends to come out faster and harder than intended, often arriving alongside years of accumulated frustration that were never actually part of the original truth. The person on the receiving end experiences not simply the truth itself, but the full force of years of buildup released all at once, which understandably produces a much larger reaction than the truth alone would have warranted. One of the more practical tools available here is choosing the moment deliberately, rather than allowing the truth to finally surface during an unrelated argument, where it will arrive already fused with whatever frustration prompted that argument in the first place. A truth delivered deliberately, in a moment chosen specifically for that purpose, carries a fundamentally different weight than the same truth erupting during an unrelated conflict, where it will inevitably be received as an escalation, rather than as the honest disclosure it was actually meant to be. Chapter 10. When the other person isn't ready to hear it. One of the more disorienting experiences available in this entire process is finally finding the courage to speak a long-withheld truth, only to discover that the person on the receiving end is not, in that moment, capable of actually hearing it. Not because the truth was delivered poorly, but because they are simply not ready, for reasons that may have nothing at all to do with you or the conversation itself. Consider how readiness to hear a difficult truth depends on far more than the truth's content or its delivery. A person exhausted, distracted, defensive by temperament, or simply unprepared for the conversation's timing may respond in ways that have little to do with the actual substance of what was said. This is worth naming clearly because it is easy, in the aftermath of a poorly received disclosure, to conclude that the truth itself was a mistake, when in fact the mismatch was largely about timing and readiness, rather than about whether the truth deserved to be spoken at all. It is worth distinguishing, too, between a difficult reception and a genuinely damaging one. Some difficult truths are met with real anger, real hurt, or real distance, and this reaction, while painful, is not necessarily evidence that speaking was a mistake. Difficult truths often produce difficult initial reactions, and the long-term outcome frequently looks very different from the immediate one.
A genuinely damaging reception is a separate category entirely, involving real harm rather than simple difficulty, and deserves separate and careful consideration for your own safety and well-being. Consider, too, the specific grief involved in speaking a truth honestly and clearly, only to have it dismissed, minimized, or met with a defensiveness that leaves no real room for it to actually be absorbed. This outcome is genuinely painful, and it is worth resisting the urge to immediately blame yourself for a poor delivery, when the actual explanation may simply be that the other person is not, and may never be, capable of receiving this particular truth the way you had hoped. This is a real limitation of speaking honestly that this book does not pretend away. Honesty changes what you have said, but it cannot guarantee what the other person does with it. There is also a specific question worth asking honestly after a difficult reception. Was this the wrong moment? Or is this simply the wrong person for this particular truth to ever fully land with? Some relationships genuinely have room to grow into greater honesty over time, with patience and repeated smaller attempts. Others, honestly assessed, do not have that room, regardless of how the truth is delivered or how many times it is attempted. And recognizing this difference honestly, rather than continuing to blame delivery for a mismatch that runs deeper, is an important part of deciding what to do next. Consider, too, that your responsibility in this process extends only to speaking honestly and with genuine care for how it lands. It does not extend to guaranteeing the other person's reaction, however much you might wish it did. This distinction matters because many people, having spoken a difficult truth and received a painful reaction, quietly conclude that the entire attempt was their fault, taking on responsibility for a response that was never fully within their control to manage in the first place. Understand, finally, that a difficult or painful initial reception does not retroactively make speaking the truth the wrong choice. It simply means the relationship now has new information to work with, and what happens from that point forward, whether the relationship grows into greater honesty, or whether it becomes clear that this particular person cannot meet you there, is genuinely separate from whether speaking was worth doing. Speaking honestly remains worth doing for your own sake, regardless of how it is received, because the weight it releases from you does not depend on the other person's readiness to receive it well. Chapter 11. Grief for the relationship you wish you'd had. Underneath a great deal of unspoken weight sits a grief that rarely gets named directly. Not grief for something lost, but grief for something that was never actually available in the first place. The parent who could not offer what was needed. The partner who could not meet a particular kind of honesty. The relationship that, however loving in its own way, was never going to become the specific relationship a person quietly hoped it might. Consider how this particular grief differs from ordinary loss, and why it is so often left unprocessed as a result. Grief for something that died is at least recognized, by most people and most cultures, as legitimate and expected. Grief for something that was simply never possible has no comparable recognition. There is no ritual for it, no accepted timeline, no social permission to name it openly, and so it tends to be carried privately, often for years, disguised as ordinary disappointment rather than acknowledged as the genuine grief it actually is. It is worth naming honestly what specifically is being grieved in these situations, because the grief is rarely about the person as they actually are. It is about a version of that person or that relationship that existed only in hope. The parent who might have said the right thing at the right moment. The partner who might have been capable of a particular kind of vulnerability. the sibling who might have shown up in the specific way that was needed at a critical time. Grieving this version honestly requires first admitting that it was, in fact, only ever a hope, and that the grief is real regardless of whether the hope was ever realistic. Consider, too, how this specific grief tends to resurface at predictable moments, long after a person believes they have already made peace with the relationship's actual limits. Milestones, celebrations, and moments of genuine need often bring the hoped-for version of a relationship sharply back into focus, precisely because these are the moments when the gap between what is present and what was once hoped for becomes hardest to ignore. This resurfacing is not a sign of failed healing. It is a normal feature of grief for something that was never fully available, and it deserves to be met with the same gentleness any other grief would receive. There is a specific relief available once this grief is finally named directly, rather than continuing to be mistaken for ordinary, ongoing disappointment in a person who is still, in every practical sense, present and involved. Naming it as grief, specifically, allows a person to begin actually processing it through whatever combination of acknowledgement, mourning, and eventual acceptance any other grief requires, rather than remaining stuck indefinitely in a low-grade disappointment that never fully resolves because it has never been correctly identified for what it actually is. Consider, too, that grieving the relationship you wish you'd had does not require giving up on the relationship you actually have, nor does it require concluding that the actual relationship has no value. Many relationships that could never provide a specific, hoped-for kind of intimacy still provide real and genuine value in other forms, and holding both truths at once, genuine grief for what was never available, alongside genuine appreciation for what actually is possible, even though it can feel at first like an uncomfortable contradiction to hold simultaneously. Understand, finally, that this particular grief, once correctly named and given the space any grief requires, tends to soften in a way that unnamed, misidentified disappointment never quite manages to do. The relationship in front of you does not change simply because you have grieved the version that was never available. What changes is your relationship to the gap itself, no longer straining indefinitely towards something that was never actually possible, but instead genuinely present to what actually exists, weighed honestly against what was hoped for, and finally allowed to be mourned, rather than endlessly, silently expected.
Chapter 12. Boundaries as a form of honesty. Boundaries are often described as a form of protection, and this is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses something important. A genuine boundary is also a form of honesty, communicating clearly and directly something that would otherwise remain an unspoken, silently managed limit. A person without clear boundaries is not necessarily a person without limits. They are usually a person whose limits are being managed silently, through avoidance, resentment, or quiet withdrawal, rather than communicated directly to the people those limits actually concern. Consider the specific relationship between the unspoken weight this book has been describing and the absence of clearly stated boundaries. Much of what gets carried silently is, on closer examination, an unstated limit, a request never made, a no never spoken, a need never named, managed instead through indirect means, subtle withdrawal, quiet resentment, or simply enduring something that a direct boundary could have addressed honestly from the start. Learning to state a boundary directly is, in this sense, simply learning to speak one particular category of unspoken thing out loud. It is worth being honest about why boundaries so often go unstated, even when a person is genuinely aware of their own limits. Stating a boundary requires a specific kind of vulnerability, because it risks the other person's disappointment,
disapproval, or even anger, in a way that silently managing the same limit does not, at least not visibly, not in the moment. This is precisely why boundaries and the broader weight of unspoken things are so closely related. Both are, at their core, a trade of short-term comfort for long-term cost. Consider, too, the specific difference between a boundary and a punishment, because the two are frequently confused, both by people setting boundaries and by people receiving them. A genuine boundary is a clear statement of what a person will or will not do, offered without the intent to control the other person's behavior. A punishment is offered specifically to make someone else feel bad enough to change. Confusing the two often causes people to avoid boundaries altogether, out of a legitimate desire not to be punitive, when a clearly stated, non-punitive boundary was actually available the entire time. There is also a specific pattern worth naming. Boundaries stated for the first time, after years of a limit being silently managed instead, are often received poorly, at least initially, by people who have grown accustomed to the previous unstated arrangement. This difficult initial reception is not evidence that the boundary was wrong to state. It is simply evidence that a genuine change has occurred, and genuine changes to a long-standing dynamic are rarely received smoothly on the first attempt, regardless of how reasonable the boundary itself actually is. Consider, too, that stating a boundary honestly does not guarantee it will be respected, and this is a real limitation worth naming directly rather than glossing over. A boundary is a statement of what you will do, not a guarantee of how another person will behave. Its value lies in its honesty and its clarity, not in its ability to control someone else's response. And understanding this distinction in advance prevents the specific disappointment that comes from expecting a boundary to function as a guarantee rather than as the honest communication it actually is. Understand, finally, that learning to state boundaries clearly is, in a very real sense, the practical application of everything this book has been building toward. Taking something that has been carried silently, examined honestly, and finally spoken plainly to the person it actually concerns. A boundary, stated this way, is not a wall built to keep people out. It is a form of honesty, offered to the people closest to you about what is actually true for you, which is, in the end, exactly what this entire book has been asking you to learn to offer.
Chapter 13. What forgiveness actually requires. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood concepts connected to the weight of unspoken things, largely because it is so often described as a single decision, rather than as the layered, sometimes lengthy process it actually tends to be. Many people, having decided intellectually to forgive someone, are confused and discouraged when the actual feeling of resentment persists, concluding, mistakenly, that their forgiveness must have failed, when in fact it may simply still be underway. Consider what forgiveness is not, because clearing away these misconceptions is often necessary before the real process can begin. Forgiveness is not the same as deciding the original harm did not matter, or did not really happen, or was somehow acceptable after all. It is not the same as reconciliation, which requires the participation of both people, and is not always possible or wise. It is not the same as forgetting, which is rarely within a person's control, regardless of intention. Confusing forgiveness with any of these related but distinct concepts makes it feel far more elusive and far more like failure than the actual process genuinely requires. Consider instead what forgiveness actually involves at its core. A gradual release of the specific expectation that the past could have gone differently, combined with a decision to stop allowing the original harm to continue actively shaping the present.
This is worth distinguishing carefully from excusing the harm, because a person can hold someone fully accountable for what they did while simultaneously releasing the ongoing grip that harm has had on their present emotional life. These two things, accountability and release, are often assumed to be in tension, but they are, in fact, entirely compatible. It is worth naming honestly that forgiveness, understood this way, is primarily for the benefit of the person doing the forgiving, rather than for the person being forgiven. The ongoing resentment a person carries towards someone who harmed them continues to cost that person real, present-day energy, regardless of whether the original harm doer ever knows, acknowledges, or benefits from the forgiveness at all. This reframing matters because it removes forgiveness from the realm of something owed to another person and repositions it instead as something undertaken deliberately for one's own genuine relief. Consider, too, the specific role that speaking the original unspoken harm plays in this process, because forgiveness attempted without ever actually
Naming what happened tends to be considerably harder to sustain. A harm that has never been spoken aloud, even only to oneself, a journal, or a trusted listener, rather than the person who caused it, often remains oddly unprocessed, resurfacing repeatedly despite genuine intellectual efforts to move past it. Naming the harm specifically, in the same way this book has asked throughout for unspoken things to be named specifically, tends to be a necessary step before genuine forgiveness becomes possible. There is also a particular timeline worth being honest about. Forgiveness rarely arrives on the schedule a person consciously wants it to, and attempting to force it before its actual work is complete tends to produce a brittle, premature version that collapses under the first real test. Genuine forgiveness, built through the gradual process described in this chapter, tends to be more durable precisely because it was not rushed, and allowing it the time it actually requires, rather than the time a person wishes it required, is itself part of the honest work this chapter is describing. Understand, finally, that forgiveness, correctly understood, is not a gift owed to the person who caused harm, nor is it a single decision that either succeeds or fails on the first attempt. It is a gradual, sometimes uneven process of releasing an old expectation about the past, undertaken primarily for your own genuine relief, made considerably more possible once the original harm has finally been named clearly, rather than carried as one more unspoken weight, indistinguishable from all the others in this book. Chapter 14. Becoming someone who can be known. Every chapter in this book has, in its own way, been building toward a single underlying question. Are you someone who can actually be known by the people closest to you? Or are you someone whose closest relationships are conducted primarily with a carefully managed version of yourself, however genuine and however loving that version may otherwise be? This is not a question with a simple yes or no answer for most people. It is a question of degree and of ongoing practice, rather than a fixed trait a person either has or lacks. Consider what actually being known requires, because it is more specific than simply spending time with people or sharing surface-level information with them. Being known requires that the parts of you that are inconvenient, imperfect, or complicated are at least occasionally visible to the people you are closest to, rather than permanently managed out of view in favor of a smoother, more presentable version. This does not mean total indiscriminate disclosure of everything to everyone. It means that somewhere, with someone, the whole picture is actually available to be seen. It is worth being honest that becoming someone who can be known is genuinely uncomfortable, and this discomfort does not fully disappear with practice, even though it does tend to become more manageable over time. Every disclosure of something previously hidden carries real risk. the risk of a changed perception, a changed relationship, a reaction that cannot be fully controlled or predicted in advance. This book has not been asking you to eliminate this discomfort. It has been asking you to weigh it honestly against the alternative cost of remaining permanently unknown, even by the people who love you. Consider, too, the specific practice this shift actually requires, because it rarely happens through a single dramatic disclosure. It tends to happen through repeated small experiments. A minor disagreement voiced instead of swallowed. A genuine need named instead of hidden. A small imperfection allowed to show instead of carefully concealed. Each one testing, in relatively low-stakes territory, whether being known produces the catastrophic consequence long assumed, or something considerably more survivable than that. Each successful experiment makes the next slightly easier, in the same gradual way described earlier regarding unlearning an inherited curriculum of silence. There is a specific relief available to a person who has genuinely practiced this shift over time, distinct from any single conversation or disclosure. The relief of no longer needing to manage every interaction quite so carefully, because the people closest to them have already seen enough of the whole picture that there is less left to protect. This relief is worth naming directly, because it is the practical payoff of everything this book has been describing. Not a single moment of release, but a gradually accumulating lightness, built experiment by experiment, disclosure by disclosure, over real time. Consider, too, that becoming someone who can be known does not require becoming known by everyone equally. Some relationships genuinely have more room for this kind of visibility than others, and it is entirely reasonable to be more fully known by a small number of people than by everyone in your life indiscriminately. The goal of this chapter is not universal transparency. It is ensuring that somewhere, with someone, the whole and honest version of you actually exists and is actually seen, rather than being permanently unavailable to anyone at all. Understand, finally, that this shift, once genuinely underway, changes the felt experience of relationship itself. Connection built on a carefully managed image, however warm, always carries a quiet background awareness that the connection is somewhat conditional on the management continuing successfully. Connection built on being genuinely known, even partially, carries a fundamentally different quality, a settledness that does not depend on ongoing vigilance, because there is simply less left that requires protecting.
Chapter 15. Putting the weight down. You have now moved through the specific mechanics of how unspoken things accumulate weight, where your own particular silences were first taught to you, which burdens were genuinely never yours to carry, what fear is actually protecting when it keeps something unsaid, and what it actually takes, gradually and imperfectly, to become someone who can finally be known. What remains is the simplest and, in some ways, the most difficult part, actually setting the weight down, rather than continuing to study it indefinitely from a safe intellectual distance. Consider that putting the weight down does not require a single dramatic gesture, applied all at once to every unspoken thing you have ever carried. It happens the same way the weight accumulated in the first place. One conversation, one boundary, one small, honest disclosure at a time. Each one slightly lightening a load that took years, sometimes decades, to build up. Expecting a single decisive moment to resolve everything at once is itself a subtle way of avoiding the actual, gradual work this book has been describing throughout. It is worth returning, one final time, to the distinction this book has insisted on from its opening pages. Not everything needs to be spoken to everyone.
Some of what you carry genuinely belongs to a private, internal reckoning, rather than a conversation with another person. Recognized honestly, released deliberately, without ever needing to be voiced aloud to anyone but yourself. Other things genuinely do need to be spoken, to a specific person at a specific moment, and no amount of private processing will substitute for that conversation actually happening. Learning to tell these two categories apart, honestly and case by case, is perhaps the single most practical skill this entire book has been building toward. Consider, too, that putting the weight down is not a permanent achievement, arrived at once and never revisited. New, unspoken things will accumulate over the course of an ordinary life, and old patterns of silence, deeply grooved by years of practice, will occasionally reassert themselves under stress, even after genuine progress has been made. This is not evidence of failure. It is simply the ongoing nature of the work, requiring the same honest attention, applied again and again, that any other lifelong practice requires. There is a particular kind of freedom available to a person who has genuinely done this work, even imperfectly, even incompletely. Not the freedom of having resolved every difficult relationship or spoken every difficult truth, but the freedom of no longer mistaking silence for a cost-free default, of knowing clearly which weights are genuinely theirs to carry and which were never rightfully theirs at all, and of having practiced enough times to trust it, that being genuinely known by the people closest to them tends to produce far less catastrophe than years of careful management once predicted it would. Consider, finally, that the specific unspoken things named throughout this book, the resentment never voiced, the boundary never stated, the grief never named, the image maintained long past its usefulness, are not unique to you. They are the ordinary furniture of most human lives, carried by nearly everyone in some form, however differently distributed across different people and different histories. Recognizing this shared quality does not erase your own specific weight, but it does remove some of the isolation that so often accompanies it, replacing a private sense of unique burden with the more accurate understanding that this work, in some form, is simply part of what it means to live honestly among other people. Understand, finally, that the weight of unspoken things is not a life sentence, exactly as this book stated in its opening pages, and you are now equipped with something more useful than that reassurance alone. A specific, practical understanding of where your own particular weight came from, what it has been protecting, and what it will actually take, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, boundary by boundary, to finally set it down. That work does not end with the final page of this book. It begins there, in the next ordinary conversation, where an old, familiar silence rises up again, and you finally have what you need to choose, deliberately, to speak instead.